Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our second part of our cattle and carcass training webinar. We hope everybody had a safe and blessed Thanksgiving holiday. I am Jody Pitcock, and I will be your moderator tonight. I am with AMS Livestock and Poultry Programs. I will be serving as the moderator for this evening and for our second part of our four-part series. Before we get too far down the road tonight, I would like to talk about a few housekeeping items that we need to discuss. Just so everybody knows that tonight's speakers' presentations have been pre-recorded. However, we will be doing a live Q&A. With that, you can submit your questions in the Q&A section down below. Participants are in listen mode only this evening, so you will be able will not be able to ask your questions verbally. At the completion of each speaker's presentation, we will host a live Q&A to take a few questions as time allows. I anticipate this session to last approximately 2 hours this evening, depending on the number of questions received. At the following follow-up of this evening's session, you will receive an email with a participation survey. We ask that you fill out these surveys because they will aid in helping us build future cattle carcass training center events and activities that benefit the U.S. beef industry. So your responses are appreciated and anonymous. At this time, before we go into our first speaker, I'd like to give you an introduction of how the cattle and carcass training centers come about. In the 2018 Farm Bill, it directed USDA to establish regional and cattle carcass training centers in order to collaborate with industry and academia to provide educational and training opportunities to stakeholders interested in the official quality grading of feeder cattle, fed cattle, and beef carcasses in the United States. The objectives of these activities is to limit the subjectivity in the application of beef grading standards, both live and carcass, build confidence in the price of the producer's cattle, and provide investors more assurance in the cattle delivery system. In September of 2019, USDA announced the selection of 3 locations: West Texas A&M University in Canyon, Texas, Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the USDA Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. In collaboration with these partners, AMS seeks to provide a variety of educational resources, events, and projects to support the beef industry's knowledge and understanding of the cattle delivery system, the role that the producer, feeder, processor, and USDA plays in bringing high-quality beef to the America's market. For more information on the Cattle Carcass Training Center, please visit their website to learn more about the center and upcoming events. Without further ado, I'd like to move on and introduce our first speaker of tonight. First speaker tonight comes from Colorado State University, Dr. Jennifer Martin. Dr. Jennifer Martin is Associate Professor in Meat Safety and Quality and received her Master's in Science in 2010 and a PhD in 2014 from Texas Tech University before joining the Colorado State faculty in the late spring of 2015. Dr. Martin has an active research program which focuses on the quality and safety of meat and meat products. Her program focuses on exploring options, opportunities, and development of solutions with and for industry stakeholders. In addition to research, Dr. Martin teaches numerous undergrad and graduate courses, supervises multiple student organizations, and is involved in several and local national livestock organizations. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Martin.
Thanks for the introduction, Jody, and thank you again for asking CSU to be a part of this virtual webinar series for the cattle and carcass training centers. CSU is really proud to be a part of this partnership and the collaboration that exists between not only the entities, but also with the USDA Ag Marketing Service. And for CSU's portion of the webinar series, I'm going to begin today by discussing the science behind the grade. And specifically, we'll discuss today how biology and physiology impacts production, performance, carcass quality, and acceptance. Now, to do this presentation, normally I'm in a room with quite a few people and it's fairly interactive. So in absence of that interaction, I'm going to ask you for a second, wherever you're sitting, to envision a high quality beef eating experience. What does that look like to you? It may be that you envision a beautiful prime carcass. It may be that you envision your perfectly cooked steak and it's dinner time, so maybe you really are envisioning, or maybe you're partaking in that perfectly cooked steak. If you're me, whenever I think of a high quality beef eating experience, it almost always includes brisket, or maybe it's a nice juicy hamburger. So there are many different things that we value when we think about beef quality. But when we really break down beef quality into a scientific understanding, we focus on a few important criteria. First of those are intrinsic traits. And by intrinsic traits, we're talking about palatability, which specifically means tenderness, juiciness, and flavor as it refers to the beef eating experience. Those terms, or palatability itself, can apply to other assets of the sensory experience if we're talking about other foods. The safety of our product is an intrinsic trait. The nutrition and nutritional value of that product is an intrinsic trait, as well as the appearance. So color, packaging, what it looks like, whether it's at the retail store, food service, or when you're purchasing at a restaurant. If you look at that top right-hand side, the bar graphs that you see there tell us a bit what consumers value when it comes to the intrinsic traits. And you notice tenderness, juiciness, and flavor by far overwhelm all other traits that we see in there in ranking of importance. Extrinsic traits we're seeing today are becoming more and more important. And one of those would be price, the price of the product. The production strategy is organic, grass-fed, all natural, humanely raised, all of these different terms that we see being placed on labels that are part of verification programs. Those have value and are considered part of beef quality. Also, socio-cultural values. So not necessarily product quality attributes, but attributes that represent the product itself and the value the consumer places on those specific attributes. So welfare, sustainability initiatives, locally raised are some of the things we may think of when we hear the term extrinsic traits. We're going to focus a bit today on palatability. When we focus on palatability, we focus specifically in beef on tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. And if you look at the top, you see a summary of the past 6 national beef quality audits. And you notice that in 2011 and 2016, food safety, we'll talk about the role of safety here in a second, was the #1 criteria, but eating satisfaction. And as we go through today's presentation, we're going to examine a bit why this is such an important criteria for products that we're producing, but it's also very difficult to do and to balance that with some of the other things we'll talk about through today's presentation. So what do we know about palatability? We know that it's important. Consumers consistently tell us that they want to have a good eating experience. Just like all of us, when we envision that good eating experience when it comes to beef, there's something that we expect when it comes to consuming beef at home or at a restaurant. We know that consumers value tenderness and that they consider tenderness as an essential trait for their acceptance, meaning that if the product is not tender, consumers won't accept it. And this is not new information for the beef industry, but one of the things the beef industry has done very well in response to that information, they've invested in improving tenderness. And that's why today, over 90% of steaks produced in the US, whether they're at food service or at retail, are considered tender or very tender. And that's because for decades, consumers were telling us tenderness is essential. It is a high priority for our eating experience. The industry invested in many different ways to enhance tenderness. And we'll talk about some of those ways as we go through today's presentation. We also know that now flavor may be equally as important to tenderness. And actually, 58% of consumers say that flavor is more important than tenderness. And if you look at that pie chart there on the right-hand side, you see a bit of a graphic representing that. We also know that consumers of those three quality traits tend to place the least amount of value on juiciness. And that's something that we're probably going to see be explored more in the future as we are able to understand a bit more of tenderness and understand a bit more of the drivers of flavor and consumer preferences for flavor. So if we focus a bit more on palatability, what are things that we can do to maximize palatability, to guarantee, if you will, palatability, or at least to understand palatability a bit better? And what are the best tools for understanding and predicting and being assured that we can provide a high quality eating experience is our quality grading system in the US. So if you look here at this bar chart, this depicts percent consumer satisfaction as it relates to marbling score, which is corresponded in this particular case with quality grade. So if you look on the far right-hand side, you see that the prime quality grade, slightly abundant or moderately abundant marbling score, is associated with over 98% consumer satisfaction, meaning that the majority of consumers, almost all consumers, if they consume a prime steak, they are going to have a high quality eating experience with that consumer experience. If we shift over to choice, the thing that I hope you notice when you see the choice bar graphs is there's quite a bit of variation. So in that low choice category, we would see in the small marbling range, only 62% of consumers had a high quality or a satisfactory eating experience. If we move over into the upper 2/3 choice, whether it's modest or moderate marbling, 82 to 88% of consumers had a satisfactory or an acceptable, a good eating experience when they consume steaks and with those marbling scores or with that quality grade. So we know from this data and an abundance of other data that the quality grading system in the US does a great job of predicting relatively confidently the eating experience that a consumer can expect to have with the product that they purchase either at retail and prepare at home or purchase at a restaurant. So the question is, if marbling is so highly correlated with a positive eating experience, if it is at present one of our best tools of predicting the likelihood that a consumer will have a high quality eating experience, why don't we just produce all prime beef? Why don't we just shoot for the top of the marbling scores and try to produce as much high marbled beef as we can? And the reality is we do a pretty good job as an industry of producing high quality beef carcasses. So if you look at the top left-hand side, you see the summary of the National Beef Quality Audits from 1991 to 2016. And you see a remarkable increase in the percentage of carcasses that are grading prime and choice. You can see that also reflected in the table below. Not only do we see more carcasses today grading prime, we see more carcasses grading choice and fewer carcasses grading select. So we know that our quality grading system in the US does a great job of predicting consumer satisfaction. We know that it's one of the best tools that we have of predicting the eating experience a consumer will have. And in order to guarantee a more positive eating experience, we have invested in producing higher quality carcasses, and it's paid off. I think one of the most interesting facts of that, if you look at the quality grade spreads and quality grade statistics for this year specifically compared to last year, we see that in May of 2019, about 8% of carcasses were grading prime. Fast forward to May of this year, 11 to 12% of carcasses in the US graded carcasses were grading prime. So we've done a great job as a US beef industry of investing in the quality of beef that we're producing, and that investment has paid off by a higher and higher percentage of carcasses grading choice or higher. So what we know though is that producing high quality beef is an art. It's something we're very good at in the US, but it's also a balance. Not only is the quality grade of the animal or of the carcass important for predicting eating satisfaction, but the yield of that carcass is just as important from an efficiency and economic perspective. So if we look again at the National Beef Quality Audit, the table on the top left-hand side demonstrates US yield grades and quality grades over the past 25 years. So from 1991 to 2016. It also takes a look at carcass weights and fat thickness and the size of the ribeye or the longissimus muscle in those carcasses. And what I hope you're seeing when you look at that is that increase in marbling score, the increase in quality grade that we've been able to measure and observe in the US has also been met with an increase in yield grade. An increase in yield grade, we'll talk about here in a second what that means from a yield perspective, but we can see most notably it's been one of the causes for that is an increase in carcass weights and an increase in fat thickness. So we are able today to produce higher quality grading carcasses, but that higher quality has come at a balance, and that balance has been increases in yield grades, increases in hot carcass weights, and in some cases, increases in external fat thickness. When you look at the yield grade distribution from the 2016 National Beef Quality Audit, you see that most cattle in the US fall within that 2.5 to 4 yield grade range. Again, we'll take a look in the next slide to see what does that actually mean when it comes to efficiency. So we must, in order to be efficient and in order to be economic in the US beef industry, we must balance quality with yield. And this is something that you know very well. And there's a reason why we can't produce all prime and all choice carcasses, because it's a balance. And we know that those increases in quality grade, as we just observed, come with concurrent increases in hot carcass weight, come with concurrent increases in external fat thickness, and then subsequently external increases in yield grade. And what do the yield grades mean, and how are they utilized in today's beef industry? So if we look at the 5 primary yield grades that you see on your screen, you can see there's quite a bit of a disadvantage to having higher yield grading carcasses, meaning they produce less boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. They're producing more fat, less high quality meat that can be marketed in other ways. And what we see when we look at these numbers and we begin to flesh out within a yield grade what the quality grades look like, we see that the majority of carcasses that are grading prime and choice generally grade within the yield grade 2 to yield grade 3. Very few carcasses grading yield grade 1, very few carcasses grading yield grade 5. We see that yield grade 2 to yield grade 3 be an area where most of our prime choice carcasses are falling. And what does that mean? And I think the thing that it should mean, hopefully to you who are in this industry, is that producing high quality beef is not only a balance, and these increases that we have observed in quality grade must also be met with top of mind efforts towards maintaining high yielding carcasses. It's not only a science, or it's not only a balance, but it's also a science. In order to balance eating quality, which we know is highly predicted with USDA quality grade, and yield, we must understand a bit more the science of muscle, fat, and skeletal development. And furthermore, we must understand the variables that impact and influence carcass performance and eating quality. We know what the consumer finds valuable. We know that when it comes to their eating experience, it has to have tenderness, it must have good flavor, and it must be juicy. We know that consumers today are placing more value on socio-cultural claims, welfare, sustainability, production systems. It's much more complicated than saying we're going to go out and produce really high quality carcasses, because there is a science that goes into that while maintaining top of mind effort to yield and these other claims that are important to a consumer. So really, when we think about producing high quality beef, it is one of the best examples of a complicated science. And it's one of the reasons why it's fun as a scientist to investigate beef quality. But really, high quality beef starts all the way back at the cellular level. It goes from the cell, when we have a developing embryo, to a calf, and the mother specifically when she's carrying that animal during gestation. Obviously, there are parts of the feeding segment, whether it's feed yards or stocker cattle. And then lastly, what happens to the carcass and how that carcass is able to yield, hopefully highly, a very high quality carcass that can deliver a high quality eating experience. So when we think about beef quality, building high quality beef starts at the cell and ends at the rail. And this is where the fun part of me as a scientist gets to come out. When we think about grading beef, when we think about producing high quality beef, it's really easy to focus on the end product. It's really easy to focus on the carcass in the cooler, or the calf in the feed yard, and what those variables that we know are going to impact the carcass itself. But when we really want to have a measurable impact on beef quality in a way that is sustainable, in a way that can withstand some of the other environmental challenges that we'll talk about as we move through today's lecture, it really does start at a cellular level. And what we know about beef quality is many of the variables that impact beef quality, so tenderness, flavor, and juiciness, are impacted by the development of muscle, the development of bone and connective tissue, and the development of fat. And we further know from a scientific perspective that those three cells, or those three attributes, starts with our mesenchymal stem cells. And here's where we're going to take a shift from talking about cattle grading and carcass quality and transition a bit into science. And we know that at the cellular level, these cells, these mesenchymal stem cells, are going to differentiate and produce muscle. They're going to differentiate and produce fat. They're going to differentiate and produce bone and connective tissue. And how they differentiate, the levels of which they differentiate, and many of the variables that go on in that process are going to impact the quality of the carcass that we see on the rail. So truly, beef quality begins at the cellular level. And it's not until we see those, the payouts of those at the rail that we're able to understand and truly appreciate what goes on when the animal is first forming. So today we're going to take a bit of a foray, if you will, into the science of skeletal development, the science of muscle development, and the science of fat development. Certainly not an all-inclusive exploration of this science. And I think one of the things you'll learn and hopefully develop an appreciation for is that if we focus only on the finished product or only on the finished animal, we're leaving out a ton of opportunities to have really dramatic improvements that start well before we get to that point. And the process by which we're able to achieve improvements and accomplish objectives and goals as they relate to beef quality and beef grading really is quite complex. And so we're going to hope to develop an appreciation for that and give a bit of a foundation for that understanding. So the science of skeletal development, and you may have never thought about how bones develop and how your own bones form and what goes on when you're an embryo all the way until where you're at today and you have fully mature bones. But I think we can all appreciate that high quality cattle begin with good skeletal structure. And so when we view a skeleton of an animal, as you'll see in the next couple of weeks when you take a look at live animals and how live animal traits correlate to carcass quality, we know that skeletal structure is similar to the foundation of a house. And it's really, really difficult to build a strong house without a strong foundation. Just like it's really, really difficult to build high quality beef or high yielding beef without a strong skeletal system. And one of the most interesting ways in which this happens when we relate to meat producing animals or muscle itself is that bones serve as levers for skeletal muscles. So without our skeletal system, our muscular system does not exist. Our skeletal muscular system does not exist. So they play a really unique and important relationship with each other. We also know that skeletal structures form prenatally, and the bone is formed from the mesoderm layer during embryonic development. And at birth, we also know that bone content is relatively high, about 2 parts bone to 1 part lean. And what happens as an animal matures, as they accumulate more tissue, more lean tissue and more fat tissue especially, that bone content decreases proportionally. So we are born with a relatively, we and animals are born with a relatively high ratio of bone to other tissues, but as we age and as we mature, we actually see that begin to decrease. We also know that nutrition, use, hormones, management can all influence postnatal skeletal development and bone growth. If you watched any TV or went to a public school, you all know that calcium does a body good, and milk specifically does a body good and aids in skeletal development. So calcium levels obviously influence skeletal growth. Functional use influences bone growth. So bones that are being used more are going to grow, and we'll see that occur as an animal matures. We also know that castration and estrogen exposure can inhibit bone growth. So we talk about those specifically because those are common production practices used in beef cattle production, where we may castrate our male male calves and to steers, or we may provide estrogen as well. And both of those practices can inhibit bone growth. So we know there are a variety of things that go on outside of the animal that can influence bone development. We also know that good structural development lays a foundation for a strong muscular system. We know that muscle or bones that are used more frequently tend to have more support for muscle growth. Once the animal is born, some of the postnatal changes that occur relative to skeletal development. We know that muscle growth occurs longitudinally. Skeletal growth occurs longitudinally, meaning bones get longer. And one of the neatest things, I think, from a person who teaches anatomy and physiology and has really over the past 10 years developed a greater appreciation for skeletal structure is our bones grow in length, not in width or girth. We only see that width or girth growth in mature animals. So after they've reached their growth plateau, then we'll see bones grow in width. But in developing animals, especially in the time frame that we think about young cattle and cattle that we would see being the predominant age group in the U.S. beef industry, most of their skeletal growth occurs longitudinally. We know that the longitudinal growth in the skeleton occurs at the epiphyseal plate or the growth plates, and it occurs by ossification, meaning that our bones are growing at the end and they're going to keep growing at the end, and they're going to turn, the cartilage is going to transition into bone, and bones are going to get longer and longer. We know that the amount of bone growth depends on the rate of new cell production as well as the size of cells before they ossify. So eventually bone growth will plateau, and we'll see examples of this over time. The amount of bone growth is really influenced by osteocytes or fibroblasts that are going to turn into bone, or the size of cells before they actually ossify or turn into bone. And so if we leave the science aside for a second and know and can at least appreciate that the process of bone growth and development, bones grow in length, not in width. It's a process that is cellularly based and really depends on a lot of prenatal attributes that impact the number of skeletal cells that are present and development that occurs prenatally. Why do we care as it relates to beef quality, and how does skeletal development impact beef quality? So let's tie these two together for a second. Again, the skeletal system creates the foundation for muscle development. We cannot build a good house without a good foundation, and our skeletal system really sets the foundation for muscle development and then later on muscle quality. We also know that as bones grow longitudinally, muscles also grow with them, and we see the most growth being around muscles and bones that are used more frequently. So think of bones and muscles of the limb versus those that are associated with the thorax or other parts of the body. We also know that when it comes to skeletal development, a large frame size is usually associated with a faster rate of lean meat growth. So animals that have a high growth rate, a high skeletal growth rate, tend to deposit more lean muscle and tend to be later maturing than those that have a smaller frame size. And so when we think about the different frame sizes that we see in the U.S. cattle population, we see quite a bit of variety. And that variety in frame size can give us good indications of what quality we can expect in the meat of that animal. So large frame size, generally more leaner cattle, or more leaner carcasses and leaner beef, also tend to be later maturing. So we're going to transition now into our discussion about muscle development. This is, as a meat scientist, probably one of my most favorite things, so I'm going to try to narrow my focus and scope to really set a foundation for understanding the science of muscle development. But know, most importantly, that muscle development begins early in gestation. And we need to think about that for a second. Muscle development begins early in gestation. In fact, in the first 2 months of gestation, or the first 2 months of pregnancy, we see the development of primary muscle cells. In months 2 through 8 of pregnancy, the secondary muscle cells are formed, and we see the majority of skeletal muscle formation. That means animals, the majority of their skeletal muscle formation occurs well before they're ever on the ground. Okay, think about this for a second. The majority of skeletal muscle formation begins before birth. In fact, the number of skeletal muscle cells is largely set by month 8 of pregnancy. Now, when I was putting together my slides, I was having a conversation with my mom, and I said, Mom, the fact that I don't have big biceps is probably because of you, right? Because we know that the majority of skeletal muscle cell development occurs prenatally. But we also know that in that time, skeletal muscle itself isn't a priority for energy partitioning. We're not seeing a whole lot of growth of our skeletal muscle cells. They're there, they're formed, and the number of cells is set by month 8. But after growth, that's where we see the growth in size. That's where we see muscles get larger. And most muscle growth after birth is hypertrophic, meaning it's an increase in size of the muscle cell versus the number of muscle cells. Whenever I teach this topic to my students, I always joke about wishing that I could overcome for the lack of prenatal muscle cell development in my biceps by taking pills that would allow me to get more muscle cells. We know that that's not possible, that most muscle growth occurs by hypertrophic growth, meaning cells get larger in size. So what does this mean as it relates to beef quality? Most importantly, prenatal factors influence skeletal muscle development. And we are just in the past few decades, and especially moving into the next couple of decades ahead of us, with the technology we have today, really beginning to understand the important role that prenatal factors, and specifically prenatal nutrition and management, can play in the development of skeletal muscle. We also know, because of this increase in technology, that management of cows in mid-gestation, specifically in that time where we see secondary muscle cells growing, is highly correlated with muscling. So poor nutrition during gestation can lead to light muscling and low yield, meaning the animal from the start, from birth, has fewer muscle cells. Fewer muscle cells mean fewer muscle. Less muscle that will be developed, because postnatally, muscle growth occurs by growth in size of cell versus in the number of cells. So management of cows during pregnancy goes a long way in helping set these animals up after birth for high muscle, high yielding carcasses once they reach that stage. So what can that mean from a management perspective? Again, if I go back to my own example, it means I can blame my mom for the reason I don't have big biceps, and I can think about the importance of prenatal nutrition into development of muscles postnatally. And that really impacts when we think about cow management and cow herd management, some things that we can do to better set our cattle, the calves, up for higher likelihood of high yield and high quality grade. So postnatal changes, what happens to muscle after birth? So at birth, the focus of muscle growth really tends to be muscles that are associated with the skeleton. When we think about energy, energy is partitioned to where it is most needed. So in development, in utero, we said that skeletal muscle cells don't see much energy partitioned to them because there's no need for skeletal muscle cell growth. Instead, we see in utero most muscle most energy partitioning directed towards development of the heart, brain, and other really important vital organ systems that also have different types of muscle cells associated with them. At birth, again, energy is partitioned to the body system that needs it most. We see rapid growth of the skeleton at birth. We see maintenance of body functionality at birth. And so most of the energy relative to skeletal muscle development is associated with bones and muscles of the skeleton versus those that we use for movement, for example. After birth, though, we see changes in muscles that are not necessarily associated with the primary skeleton, more muscle changes associated with muscles of the limb. This really is a reflection of the use. So what we see happen over time, and the example I like to use is think about a giraffe. When a giraffe first walks, it doesn't have a whole lot of muscle control. Same for a calf, right? Not a whole lot of muscle control in their limbs because those limbs haven't been used yet. So the muscles within there aren't strong. They're not well developed. They're not growing. But with more use and with more frequent use, we see the muscles get larger, muscle cells get larger, support muscles get larger. And so we see energy partition to the development of muscles that aren't necessary for biological functionality, but are more necessary for use or reflection of the nutrition of the animal. One of the other things that we see after birth is this shift in muscle fiber type. Primarily, when we think about ruminant animals specifically, they primarily have type 1 muscle fibers at birth. And this chart there on the bottom right-hand side, I won't read it for you, but it describes some of the physiology that exists for each of these muscles. So there are 4 primary types of muscle fibers that exist across all mammals. For ruminants specifically, they're primarily characterized by having type 1 muscle fibers, which are oxidative in metabolism, meaning they use oxygen. They have an aerobic metabolism. We also see type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers. If we shift from type 1 to type 2A and type 2X, we see this shift from aerobic metabolism using oxygen to glycolytic metabolism using glycogen, or sugar, if you will, as the primary source of energy. We also see the speed at which the muscles contract, or the contraction speed, changes from very slow contraction with type 1 to very fast with type 2. Other important things when we look within this chart, just a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. Look at the lipid content within the muscle fiber types. So relatively small or relatively high lipid content in type 1 and type 2A muscle fibers, relatively low lipid content in type 2X muscle fibers. Lastly, the bottom row gives you a couple of examples. So type 1, a good example of a type 1, a muscle that has a high number of type 1 muscle fibers is the diaphragm. Type 2A would be a good example of that would be the psoas major or the tenderloin. And then if we shift to type 2X, we're thinking about muscles that are associated with the chuck and round. And why does this matter? So let's talk about what happens after an animal is born. We said that after the animal is born, we see that shift of muscle development away from the primary skeleton to muscles of the limb, muscles that are used more frequently. We see them start to get, those muscle cells get larger in size, the muscles are more developed. We also see this shift in the predominant muscle fiber. So if we were to examine a very young calf, say right after birth, we would see the primary or the majority of muscle fibers within that animal are type 1 muscle fibers. So oxidative, high lipid content, high fatigue resistance, and they're aerobic, or they use an aerobic metabolism. As the animal ages and it matures, we see this shift from oxidative type 1 type fibers to type 2 fibers. And some of those type 2 fibers we said are type 2A with a mix of oxidative and glycolytic metabolism. Some are the type 2X with only glycolytic metabolism. This shift in muscle fiber transition is caused by use. So how the muscles are used, we see muscles that are used more frequently for locomotion and movement. Think of muscles of the chuck and round. They tend to be more type 2X versus muscles that are used primarily for support may fall somewhere in the middle in type 2A. Breed type, we know, has an important role in the deposition and the development of the different muscle fiber types, as well as the nutritional plane. So what the animal is consuming can depict what type of fiber is developed, or what type of fibers tend to be the majority within the muscle. We also know from a beef quality perspective that muscle fiber type and the metabolism of muscle impact a variety of beef quality factors. Probably the one that they influence the most is the ultimate pH decline. So we know that after harvest, the inherent internal pH of that carcass will begin to decline. And that process is an entire other webinar. We talk about what is responsible for postmortem pH decline, but it's an important biological process that is responsible for many of the meat quality properties that we experience today. And we also know that different fiber types have different rates and levels of pH decline in postmortem muscle. We also know that the fiber type influences marbling. So muscle fiber type 1 has a higher propensity to marble. They have a greater lipid content than type 2A or type 2X. We also know that muscle fiber type influences the cross-sectional area of the muscle, and that's a reflection of use. So if you look at the bottom, the two pictures that you see there, on the very far left, that's a picture of a tenderloin or a psoas major. On the right, that would be an eye of round. The muscle fiber type differences between those two muscles has resulted in a lot of different variables. One of those that's most obvious is the marbling. Notice the lack of marbling that we see in the eye of round. That's a type 2X muscle fiber compared to the psoas major that's a type 2A. We also know just from inherent experience, the tenderloin is more tender than the eye of round, and that's due to muscle cell cross-sectional area. We can also examine color differences in these two muscles, with the type 2X muscle fibers present in that eye of round, usually resulting in a paler colored lean than that we would expect to see in the tenderloin. So muscle fiber type and metabolism, very important in predicting and being responsible for many of these quality variables that we've seen thus far, but also from our previous discussion, we know that muscle cell development starts in gestation, and that by month 8 of gestation, that our number of skeletal muscle cells is almost set completely. And then after birth, we see changes in muscle fiber type and muscle fiber metabolism influenced by nutrition, influenced by use and exposure. Those changes that we see after birth can also impact many of the quality attributes that are important from a beef quality perspective. So gestationally, prenatally, major role as it relates to the ability of the animal to produce muscle. After birth, more likely impacting the quality of the muscle that is produced. Now let's talk for a bit about fat development. This is the one that, especially following Thanksgiving, we probably could all use a bit of a refresher on how fat cells develop, and maybe a bit of hoping we can undo some of the damages that occurred over Thanksgiving. So just like muscle cells, lipid cells develop in late gestation in the early postnatal period. So they actually develop after muscle cells. We do see some overlap in fat cell development in that secondary muscle cell development that occurs around months 2 through 8 of gestation. So late gestation, early postnatal period, we see the development of lipid cells. We also know that there is an order in which lipid cells develop. The visceral lipid cells develop first. Those are the ones that protect the internal organs. Subcutaneous second. Intermuscular between muscles, and then intramuscular within the muscle itself would be the last in order of development. We also know that adipose cells or fat cells are clustered in connective tissue or within and between muscle bundles. So they can exist in between muscles, separating muscles from each other. And when that happens, we usually see that occur in the paramycium of a muscle. Separating bundles from each other, and in some cases, even in the epimycium, separating muscles, separating one muscle from another muscle. We also know that for intramuscular fat, muscle cells exist between the primary and secondary muscle bundles. So we can see a lot of development, not in between individual muscle fibers, but groups of muscle fibers. We'll see development of intramuscular fat or marbling. We also know that the lipid storing ability of intramuscular adipocytes or intramuscular fat cells is much lower than the lipid storing ability of subcutaneous or external fat cells. And that simply means that it is much harder, takes more energy to deposit intramuscular fat than it does to deposit subcutaneous fat. Not only does it take more energy, it's also physically harder for those cells to store more adipocytes or more fat cells. They don't have the same capacity to store fat that we see on the outside of the carcass. Given the value of marbling, we know that it is difficult for those intramuscular adipocytes to have a lower ability to store lipid. It takes more energy for them to store. We also know it's the last part of adipocyte or fat cell development. But we know that the intramuscular fat or marbling is imperative for beef quality. There has been quite a bit of effort to understand the development of intramuscular fats. And one of the things that we've seen be a theme of intramuscular fat development are these pre-adipocytes. So the fat cells before they're fat cells. And collectively, those are called fibroadipogenic progenitors. And this is the foundation of intramuscular fat cells. These are the cells that lead to intramuscular fat development. And we're going to talk a bit and kind of relate these to what's going on when we talk about fat development. So if you will, look at the bottom of this picture. We talk about the point of conception, and we know at the point of conception, we have the development of these cells called fibroblasts. And these cells exist in the embryo. And by mid-gestation, these fibroblasts are being replaced by those fibroadipogenic cells, what we commonly refer to as FAPs. Those fibroadipogenic cells turn into pre-adipocytes. These are pre-fat cells. The more fibroadipogenic cells that exist, the more pre-adipocytes that exist. And then subsequently, the more fat cells that exist. And this all begins prior to birth, during the early stages of fetal development. Do we see the formation of these fibroadipogenic cells, or these FAPs? So fat development begins well before we think about an animal going into a feed yard and being placed onto a high corn or a high energy diet that we know is going to lead to fat development. Their ability to deposit fat, their ability to form fat cells starts well before that, starts well before they reach the finishing stage. So in order for animals to have the propensity or the ability to have a high quality grade, we must invest in this time in the gestational period in which these FAPs are forming and these preadipocytes are forming. Furthering that point, if we look at this, this sort of heat map and this timeline of adipocyte or fat cell development that was published last year by Zhao and colleagues from Washington State, we can see again how this relates and how fat development itself falls within the lifetime of an animal. So at conception, we see the nutrient partitioning towards organ development, brain development, lung development, heart development. But soon thereafter, not only are we seeing the investment of energy in muscle development, but we're seeing the investment of energy in fat development. So if we look at the blue area on the bottom bar, we see that within months, within weeks after conception, we see the adipocyte hyperplasia, meaning a growth in muscle cell number. Fat cell numbers. We're increasing the amount of fat cells that are present in this animal. At birth, we see adipocyte hypertrophy, meaning we're increasing the size of muscle or fat cells that exist in that animal. If we look at intramuscular fat specifically, so intramuscular fat marbling specifically, we see that marbling cells develop last, meaning they're at the end of that window. Marbling cells don't develop until right before birth and into the early weaning age of the animal. This is where we see the shift from these FAPs to preadipocytes into fat cells or adipocytes in that space that exists between birth and weaning, meaning that there's an opportunity to intervene in this space to increase the ability of these animals to marble, but they must first have these FAPs present or these preadipocytes present. After birth, we know what happens, especially post-weaning, as we move into the stocker, into the feed yard age, or into the feedlot age and the finishing age. We see fat cells, just like muscle cells, increase in size, and that can be accomplished by diets. It can be accomplished by a host of other variables. We also know that from this, subcutaneous fat develops much earlier, and it is generally more mature, and it utilizes acetate for metabolism or for the deposition of more fats, versus intramuscular fat is later developing. So subcutaneous fat develops early, marbling or intramuscular fat develops closer to birth and soon after birth. It's less mature, doesn't have the same infrastructure that subcutaneous fat does. It also utilizes glucose. That's why we can utilize high energy diets or glucose-based high glucose diets to increase the amount of intramuscular fat that an animal deposits. So if we kind of wrap these, the skeletal development, the muscle development, the fat development into a system, if you will, it really brings home the idea that building high quality beef starts at the cell and ends at the rail. So many of the things that impact the ability of a carcass to yield and to grade, quality grade specifically, start well before birth and start as not long after conception and into early embryonic development. We know that those embryonic stem cells give rise to either muscle cells, and that muscle cell number is set by month 8. Meaning that if we want to increase the number of muscle cells, it must be done prenatally. We also know that fibroadipogenic progenitors, those FAPs, originate from those embryonic stem cells. Subcutaneous fat development, the number of sub-Q fat cells, is established by birth. Those fat cells are there, then everything that happens after that point is going to deposit more subcutaneous fat. We know at that same time that intramuscular fat cells are the last in the order of production. They're the last in the order of deposition. That period soon after birth presents an awesome opportunity for intervention in improving the propensity of animals to marble well and to grade higher once they're at the carcass stage. So when we think about producing high quality beef, we'll talk here in a second about many of the variables that occur after birth and well into the finishing phase that are going to also impact beef quality. But high quality beef starts at the cellular level. It starts with the development of these cells that generate fat, skeleton, connective tissue, muscle. And we must be mindful of the foundation we are laying for animals to grade high or yield high. If the foundation isn't developed, if we don't have an understanding of the cellular level mechanisms that influence carcass quality or carcass yield, it really doesn't matter what we do on the back end because there's only so much we can do with the poor foundation. There's still, though, a requirement to balance the changes and to balance postnatal changes specifically. We know that as an animal matures, muscle growth slows and fat growth increases. If you are me, you are feeling this in 2020. The older I get, the harder it is to deposit muscle and the easier it is for one Oreo to turn into 10 pounds, it seems like. We know that muscle is replaced by fat and our muscle growth becomes much more difficult, if not impossible, as an animal matures. We also know that fat deposition, specifically intramuscular fat, is energy inefficient. And the order of deposition is the last fat that we develop. It is the least mature. It requires a different energy source than subcutaneous fat that we can only get from a dietary perspective. So not only is producing high quality beef an art and a science, it's a balance. So it takes an understanding of the bull and cow, of the dam and sire, and the roles that they play in producing high quality egg and sperm that can be fertilized to perform an embryo that has the propensity to develop these other cells, to develop the myocytes that are going to turn into muscle cells, the FAPs that are going to differentiate into skeletal cells or fat cells, those fibroblasts, the adipocytes, and the myoblasts. We also know that it's a process after conception, through embryonic development, till birth, after birth, all of the different things that occur in a lifetime of an animal. And my challenge today is to not focus on just the end, but understand that high quality beef is an art, a science, and a balance, and starts well before we see a carcass on the rail. That said, there are some things that we know can influence carcass quality. On the pre-harvest side, breed or breed type, we talked about the role of embryonic development in creating the foundation for muscle growth, fat deposition, or skeletal growth. That starts with choosing breeds and breed types, and there are certain breeds that we know are associated with high quality. There's a reason for that. We also know that prenatal nutrition, I told the story earlier, blaming my mom for my lack of a biceps. There's some truth to that. Prenatal nutrition, gestational nutrition of the cow has significant impacts on the ability of the calf to grade and yield. Likewise, when it comes to quality grading specifically, because we know that intramuscular fat deposition and development starts after birth and soon after birth prior to weaning, there's an opportunity in calf management to impact the ability of an animal to grade or an animal to yield. Some things that we've known for a while now, the age of the animal. We know that as an animal matures, they're going to deposit less muscle and more fat. So we know that older animals, especially if they have the genetic propensity, can marble well and can yield high. We also know that at that same time we're seeing mature cross-linking within the muscle, mature skeletal development, and mature fat. Those products generally are tougher. Stress prior to harvest, production systems, the use of performance technologies, beta agonists and implants. We talked about the role of castration and estrogen exposure to skeletal development. Similar relationships exist for lipid development and muscle development. So many things can happen from the time of gestation to the time of harvest that can impact meat quality. We also know that after that animal is harvested and we have a carcass, there are things that we do within the beef industry that also impact quality. Whether it's chilling and temperature, size of the carcass and the temperature we use to chill a carcass, ultimate pH decline, aging method, aging length, packaging, cooking, preparation. I'm not trying to scare anyone, but the reality is there is a host of variables from the point of conception to the point of cooking that impact quality. And if you're a meat scientist or you're in this industry, you may get overwhelmed by all of the different things that can be done to impact or that can occur that impact meat quality. And you may ask, why do we care? Why do we focus on producing high quality beef? And the reality is this, is producing high quality beef is essential. Consumers demand a high quality eating experience. When you think about the way you spend your food dollar, if our expenditures are going up, our expectation for quality is also going up. If we want to continue asking consumers to pay for high quality product, the responsibility is on us to produce high quality product. So as price increases, demand for high quality and consistency will also increase. And what does that mean from a scientific perspective and from a beef production perspective if we were to take a step back and understand the science behind quality and yield grading? I think it means that we must respect that building high quality beef starts at the cell and ends at the rail. And you could argue that it goes beyond the rail and even into the consumer's home or the restaurant. And in order to appreciate this fact, we must understand the science. And my presentation today did not give you any, maybe 0.1% of the science and the complexity that exists in the cellular development of marbling or the cellular development of muscles. We don't have time. That's an entire course that I'd be happy to help set you up with. But understanding the science gives us the ability to respect the art of producing high quality beef. And more importantly, allows us the opportunity to perfect the balance of producing high quality beef with top of mind to yield as well. So with that, thank you for participating in the webinar. I look forward to answering questions in the Q&A session. Again, this is not intended to be an all-encompassing overview of the science behind quality and yield grading, but I hope it leaves us with an appreciation for high quality carcasses that are high yielding. Those relationships start well before we see the finished animal, the carcass, and well before we see the finished product. I look forward to joining you all in the Q&A session.
Well, thank you, Dr. Martin. Man, I really appreciate that overview that you presented. You know, we've always heard that the dam contributes a high percentage of the outcome or sets the offspring up for success. And you did a great job of explaining that. Really important that we take care of them mamas because they ultimately contribute a lot more than we realized. So with this, I sure appreciate it. We had a few questions come in the chat, and so we will go ahead and have a live Q&A to address some of the questions that we received. I will go ahead and start with the first question. The first question that we received, Dr. Martin, you'd mentioned something about taller cows are leaner. And the question was, how does that relate to the mini breeds? Can you please share what you know about that?
That's a great question, and I'll start first by saying I was really tempted to open the Q&A with some Oreos and just have a mouthful of Oreos, but I refrained from doing that. But relative to the mini breed, I think most importantly is we don't really know enough from a research perspective to know what larger trends may exist, and if the proportionality that we see in skeletal development and muscle development is true for the mini breeds as it would be for a traditional beef breed. I do think, though, we can rely on what we know about the growth curve and skeletal development and fat and muscle development and the way that occurs within beef species in general. And it likely holds true for minis, but whether it's the exact same proportions, I don't think there's quite enough research yet to know that.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that response. The second question that we received, I know that it was talked about that the higher grade typically yields higher customer satisfaction. I'm curious though if a color score of the meat was also looked at and if iodine values are being considered or tested in determining the quality of fat, i.e. IMF could yield a choice or prime score, but a higher iodine value could cause the fat to be sloppier and not taste as well as some grades with a lower iodine value. Can you please share some insight?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it really highlights some differences that exist in grading systems across the globe. And so if we look at some of the other countries that have a high tech and a relatively robust grading system, Australia, for example, does use color, and they do use some other tools that we don't use as indicators of grade. Relative to fat quality, our grading system at present really isn't designed to assess fat quality for beef. There is some interest in some use of this in pork grading, but in beef, we don't really assess quality of fat or the fatty acid composition and how that relates to flavors or textures. I think there's a lot of opportunity to move in that direction, but at present, we don't utilize those tools to look at variations of different types of fat or qualities of fat. Good point, though.
Very good, very good. We have one more question that we'll take, and then we'll move to our next presenter. That question was, what is the width of the yield grade 1 animal and a yield grade 3 animal? I think that question will actually be addressed in the next presenter. So we will hold off on that question until that time, and if not, then we can address it at the live Q&A at the end. We did have one more question we'll address. It just came in, and then we'll move to the next presenter. By holding feeder cattle to heavier weights, say 800 to 900, before placing on feed or at a feedlot, does that impact the ability for those animals to reach its maximum marbling grade potential?
It certainly can. I think what we've seen about the fat development timeline is the management of those animals before they're placed in the yard can certainly have an impact on intramuscular fat or marbling development. It really gets back to management, and so the potential is absolutely there. If they're held in a stocker operation, or if they're held at other places before going to the feed yard, it certainly can have an impact on marbling development later on, or at least change the way that they are able to capitalize on the amount of time they're on a high energy diet in the feed yard.
Very good, very good. Well, I appreciate your responses. I appreciate everybody sending in their Q&As. If there's any questions that we missed, we will address them after the second presenter when we do an overall live Q&A. So at this time, I will turn it over to our next presenter. At this time, I would like to introduce our second and final speaker tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a colleague and a gentleman that I'll call a great friend, Dr. Bucky Gwartney. Dr. Gwartney is the International Marketing Specialist with the USDA Livestock and Poultry Programs. He is responsible for development and oversight of meat standards. That includes the beef yield and quality grades. He also serves as a technical expert on many meat-related activities within USDA and as a USDA representative in several international standards organizations. Dr. Gwartney attended Oklahoma State University. where he received a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture Animal Science. Then he received a Master's of Science and a PhD in Animal Science, Meat Science from the University of Nebraska. After a postdoctoral program at the University of Missouri, he joined PIC as a meat scientist and later joined the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, working in the beef quality and safety research areas. He has served as a past president of the American Meat Science Association and as the past muscle food division chair of the Institution of Food Technology. Dr. Gwartney was part of the research team that received the International Meat Science Prize for Meat Science and Technology and is an AMSA Fellow and OSU Graduate of Distinction. Please welcome Dr. Bucky Gwartney.
Thanks, Jody, for that introduction. And thank you, Dr. Martin, for a wonderful technical overview of the science behind the grade. Also, thanks to everyone out there virtually who, as a stakeholder, has taken the time to learn more about beef cattle and carcass grading. I'm Bucky Gwartney, a member of the Livestock and Poultry team here at USDA. Many of our programs, like beef grading, are service fee programs that aid the industry and add value to many commodities. My role as international marketing specialist is to manage and maintain our red meat standards so that they continue to be meaningful and relevant in today's marketplace. These would include standards like the USDA beef grades or the institutional meat purchasing specifications, which are used by the meat industry for specification-driven purchases and the labeling of their meat products. And that's also true for our domestic, foreign, and foreign trading partners. My goal tonight is to take the technical presentation you just saw and start to tie it together in a practical and meaningful way with the beef grades. I will also remind you that in session 4 of this educational series, I will take this information even further and be getting into more detail on the calculations of both quality and yield grades. So stay tuned. So let's talk about quality and yield grades. As mentioned before, quality grades are designed to predict the palatability or eating quality, if you prefer, of the beef cuts coming from a carcass. And we do this while taking many characteristics into consideration. And we'll talk about those here in a bit. For yield grades, we are predicting how much closely trimmed retail product we can get from a beef carcass. Both of these predictions are used for pricing of the carcasses and or the value of the animal that they came from, and also influence the price at wholesale and retail for the consumer. The USDA beef quality grades are hierarchical by design. This means that prime eats better than choice, and choice eats better than select, etc. This shows the probability of having a desirable eating experience with each quality grade. As you move from prime to standard, you increase the chance of having an undesirable eating experience. It's important to point out that you can still have a good eating experience with a lower grade, especially if you're an excellent chef. It's just that the probability goes down. Also, these tests were performed at a medium degree of doneness and no seasonings. Therefore, there's plenty of research and experience that says cooking degree of doneness and seasonings or meal accompaniments influence perception of eating experience. I personally prefer just salt and pepper on my grilled medium rare ribeye. The main traits we look at for quality grade determination are sex class, the overall maturity, both skeletal and lean, and the marbling level, and firmness or color of the ribeye at the 12th rib interface. The official grade of steer, heifer, cow, or bullock carcasses consists of the quality grade, yield grade, or both. The official grade of a bull carcass consists of the yield grade only. Sex class determination is important so that the grader can apply the correct grades and use the determination as additional information when applying the final grade. Today, most modern plants that harvest beef-fed cattle only procure steers or heifers, so the evaluation of bull carcasses is negligible. This would be the opposite in many European countries where intact males are routinely raised for harvest. Maturity is one of the more important traits graders evaluate in the plant for determining quality grades. And this is true for the bone maturity and the lean maturity. One of the biggest changes in evaluating maturity recently has been the adoption of using dentition to determine the age of the animal. Dentition is evaluated on the harvest floor after stunning and is the evaluation of the teeth and gum line of each animal to determine if certain teeth have erupted or not, and is a highly correlated method to animal age, with the current cutoff being less than 30 months of age or more than 30 months of age. This procedure and process is an international standard and is also important in global trade and has been adopted worldwide by most countries after the BSE issues from years ago. Once a carcass has been determined to be less than 30 months of age, skeletal maturity is considered as young, and the grader can move on to the other important traits to evaluate and is eligible for all grades. If a carcass is deemed to be older than 30 months, then it gets a special mark on the carcass, which will identify it and segregate it for further grade determination and ultimate fabrication. It is still eligible for official quality and yield rating, however, but depending on its skeletal and lean maturity, may not be eligible for the higher grade. In addition, we can also determine age by a verified age program of the actual birth of the animal. When we look specifically at the skeletal maturity, it's important to note that in general, the carcass's bones mature from back to front. The grader evaluates all areas of the carcass, but also puts a lot of emphasis on the thoracic vertebrae, which are located where the rib cut is located. This location contains cartilaginous tips that start to turn to bone at that critical 24 to 30 month of age window. One example of this I use a lot is in the human wrist. The growth plate in bones is called the physis. Almost every bone has a physis, and this is true in the wrist. The physis is made of a specialized cartilage that is located near the ends of the long bones. The physis helps the bones grow both in length and width. My daughter has broken both her growth plates in her wrist when she was younger, both playing basketball. Those growth plate areas allow the arm bone to lengthen, but once they start to get older, those cartilage growth plates will start to fuse and turn to bone. And that's what's happening on those thoracic vertebrae on the beef carcasses. When we are evaluating maturity, what are some of the things that affect maturity? Well, here are just a few. Things like gender, sex condition, breed type, implant programs, and even diet or plan of nutrition. So to recap, for maturity, we want to evaluate the physiological maturity as determined by shape and size and ossification of bones, and the color and texture of the ribeye line. All maturity indicators are considered for the determination of the grade, and there are limitless combinations of these to consider. Finally, let's talk about marbling and firmness attributes in the ribeye line surface. For the evaluation of marbling, we are looking at the fat that is contained within the muscle vein or the ribeye surface. This fat is technically called intramuscular fat, not intermuscular fat, which we call seam fat or the fat between muscles. One of the ways I learned this differentiation early on was thinking about our U.S. highway system, which we call interstates, which effectively means that the highways go between states. So that would be the seam fat, whereas marbling is the fat within the muscle. Remember from Dr. Martin's presentation that marbling is one of the last depots to be deposited in the beef animal. And that is, and this deposition is very energy inefficient, so it requires more energy. That's why we feed high energy diet during the last phases of the feeding process, in order to get the beef animals to deposit more intramuscular fat or marbling. So timing becomes very important for feeders and beef producers to balance the right amount of time and the right diet to hit their quality target. Now, even though the amount of marbling has already been determined at the time of harvest, there are some additional factors that can influence how marbling is evaluated in the meat cooler for ultimate quality grade determination. This is not a comprehensive list, but a few of these influencers are the chilling method, the amount of time the exposed lean is allowed to bloom, and the lighting under which the grader is evaluating the ribeye marbling level. For chill time, it's important that carcasses get proper chilling so that the marbling will be set and visible to the grader. A lot of beef plants take advantage of this by doing longer chills prior to grading and fabrication, maximizing the amount of marbling that is there and entirely visible to the grader at the time of grading. For bloom, what we are referring to is how the natural red beef color manifests itself once the carcass is split between the 12th and 13th rib for evaluation by the grader. An easy way to explain this is with a pound of ground beef you buy at the store. When you typically buy ground beef and take it home, it has a nice red color on the outer surface. But when you open it up and split it in half, where the internal part is exposed, the color will be darker, even purplish. The reason for the purple or darker color is that the internal part of the ground beef is not exposed to oxygen yet, and therefore it is not a red color, whereas the outer surface of the meat is exposed to oxygen, and it has that nice red color we consumers associate with high quality fresh beef. If you let that recently separated ground beef set for a while, 20 to 30 minutes, it will turn a nice red color. The same thing is true when you purchase a vacuum packaged beef product. That package does not have oxygen in it, so it's a darker color. But once opened and exposed to air, it will turn red. So for graders, it's important to have a correct bloom time on the ribeye that they are evaluating so that the best color can develop for graders to develop and evaluate. Now, there are a few conditions or defects that can happen to a carcass that will prevent it from being graded or may result in a downgraded product. One of these is called blood splash. This is a condition that can happen due to an improperly harvested carcass, resulting in the rupturing of blood vessels, which result in darker blood splotches appearing in the lean surface. Another condition is referred to as muscular stetosis, or calloused lean. Calloused lean is a condition where muscle fibers have been replaced by fatty deposits. Scientists have stated that this condition is most often found in beef and pork and is thought to be caused by muscle damage or nerve degeneration where fatty tissue can infiltrate into that area of damage. Sometimes it appears to be a highly marbled area, but it will be contrasted by areas of slightly or much lower marbling adjacent to it. Dark cutters is another issue that affects up to 1% of beef carcasses being graded. This is when the ribeye lean surface appears darker than normal and can be caused by a variety of factors. Another way to describe this condition is dark, firm, and dry beef. Some of the factors that can cause this include aggressive behavior, estrus, long-term stress, aggressive use of growth promotants, and even weather. In general, what is happening is that when any or some of these conditions are happening, the animal's energy reserves, or glycogen, and we can simplify this by calling them sugars, are being used up and being depleted. The sugar is the input for muscle metabolism, which is needed to regenerate energy, or ATP, in the muscle. Without these sugars or glycogen, the pH of the postmortem muscle cannot decrease to the normal level in the conversion of muscle to meat when the beef animal is harvested, and therefore the muscle doesn't reach the proper endpoint for pH, or the acidity of the muscle, and it becomes dark, firm, and dry. In general, live animal muscle is around 7.2 to 7.0. Normal ultimate pH would be 5.5 to 5.8, and dark, firm, dry pH 5.9 to 6.5. You can see this depicted in the diagram. The best way to prevent this is if you have cattle that have been in a long-term stress situation, they should be rested and given feed to increase their glycogen stores. Okay, that's enough for now on quality grades, and we'll cover this in even more detail in the upcoming session 4. Now let's finish up this presentation with a discussion of yield grades. Beef yield grades range from 1 to 5. Yield grade 1 is going to have the best cutability, which usually means it has less fat and more muscling, and will have the highest amount of closely trimmed retail product being available. A yield grade 5, on the other hand, will be fatter and less muscular in combination and result in the lowest amount of closely trimmed retail product. So what are the factors involved in determining yield grade? Well, the main 4 traits we need to evaluate are the amount of fat over the ribeye, the area of exposed lean in the ribeye, the weight of the carcass, and the amount of internal fat that we call kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. One of the main factors that we evaluate is the thickness of the fat over the ribeye. We commonly refer to this as back fat, and it is measured in inches at a specific place opposite the ribeye. As you'll recall from the previous presentation, this is also referred to as the subcutaneous fat, that being fat under the skin, and is the second fat component being deposited by the beef animal after the internal fat. In general, the more back fat a carcass has, the higher the yield grade will be, which means lower amount of closely trimmed retail product. Another critical factor to determine is what we call the ribeye area, and it is an indication of the amount of muscle growth and mass of the carcass. Generally, as a carcass weight increases, so does ribeye area because the animal is still growing. However, this is not a linear relationship. This measurement is in square inches and is related back to the actual carcass weight and also to the weight that a normal carcass at any given weight should have to be adequate in its muscle mass. An example of how this is relevant for determining yield grade is that if a given carcass is supposed to have a 14 square inch ribeye according to its weight, but only has a 13 square inch ribeye, then that indicates that that carcass has less muscle mass and therefore would have a less desirable or higher yield grade assigned. The opposite, of course, would be true if the ribeye area was larger than the normal ribeye area required, resulting in a better yield grade. Hot carcass weight is determined right before the carcass enters into the cooler. The amount of internal fat, referred to as the amount of kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, or KPH, is expressed as a percentage of the carcass weight. These percentages usually can range from 1 to 5%. As with the back fat measurement, a higher value or amount of fat will result in less desirable yield grade being assigned. This chart shows that the estimates for how much retail product one can expect from a certain yield grade carcass. As you can see, the lower the number, i.e. a yield grade 1, the more closely trimmed retail product you can expect. Now remember, it's important to note that when a USDA grader is considering all of these factors we've just discussed for quality and yield to make and apply a final grade determination, it's happening very fast for a grader. Now obviously the use of camera grading equipment certainly helps to augment that evaluation. And this is one of those things we'll go over in more detail in session 4. I want to finish tonight's presentation with a few graded summary slides. This first one shows the quality grade breakdown for fiscal year 2020, which is from October 2019 to October 2020. As you can see, the amount of prime carcasses graded is around 10%, while choice carcasses were around 74%. These percentages have been trending upwards for many reasons over the years. For yield grade, we see that the majority of carcasses are yield grade 3 at about 52%, and we would consider this average. Yield grade 4s and 5s, which are the lower yielding carcasses, are at about 18%, while the higher yielding yield grade 1s and 2s are at about 32%. So that concludes my presentation. I want to thank you for staying tuned in, and I hope you learned a little bit about quality and yield grading that you didn't already know, and that you're eager to learn more in our upcoming session 4. Thanks again. And now I think we are ready to answer some questions. So back to you, Jody.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gwartney. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through the quality and yield grades a little deeper. I'm kind of with you though. Salt and pepper and medium rare, and we're game on. I like it. So, anyways, we did have a few questions. I had a question that come into the chat, and we'll take this question, and then we'll have Dr. Martin join us. And if you have any other questions that you would like to ask, please submit them in the Q&A, and we will try to address them tonight here so that we can get them captured with closed caption. The question that we received, given that larger frame cattle yield better and are more efficient, how do we balance this with the larger hot carcass weight and the size of cuts?
That's a good question. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and your speakers turned up a little bit. So yes, larger weights are certainly going to mean larger cuts, larger, heavier cuts that are being fabricated traditionally. And this is very challenging when you think about putting them into a package or fitting into a box. So the industry has really gone to take advantage of these in ways that are very unique, whether it's looking at different types of fabrication, maybe doing more individual muscle type cuts. So the industry has really done a great job of dealing with the heavier carcass weights. At the same time, you know, what is that upper limit of efficiency and going to the consumer, particularly when you think about those very high value middle meats, and trying to portion a very large ribeye can be very challenging.
All right, good response, good response. We had another question that come in. That question was, when was the last time the yield grade equation was validated? I wonder, given the cattle have changed, I wonder if the equation is still holds.
Yield grade equation has not been upgraded for some time or been changed, mainly due to the fact that there's been no ask to do that by the industry. Typically, when we look at any of our grade standards, whether they're on a live standard or a carcass or meat standard, if we want to look at any adoptions of changes or things we want to update, we usually get petitioned by the industry. There's a need, there's a want, there's a reason for that. And what we'll typically do, and one of the last changes we made was back in 2017 on the dentition and some of the quality perspectives. But that's coming directly from industry issues or industry people wanting to see that. And we will certainly take that into account, and we'll address that through the industry stakeholders, through research, et cetera, and see if there is in fact a need, and we'll make those changes. But for yield grade, there has been no call to update those.
Very good, very good, very good to know. At this time, I don't see any additional questions. We'll kind of wait here, and we will see if we get a question. Let's wait a few seconds, and if we don't, then we'll close out the session with the closing comments. And I will let everybody know that next week we'll be going through live animal evaluation in session 3. So we'll be talking about live animal grade standards, application of quality and yield grade standards to live animals, and then also the CME live animal delivery process. In addition to that, week after next, and Dr. Gwartney mentioned in session 4, we'll be going into a deeper understanding and dive into the quality or the carcass grading system, calculating yield grade and quality grade. One of the questions we just received, and I think this is a really good question, and it's kind of a segue that will lead into session number 4, is how is the area of the ribeye measured?
Yeah, we will definitely go into more detail in session 4, so I'll give you a teaser to join in for that. But simplistically, it's measured actually in square inches, and then based on that measurement in relation to how much the carcass weighs, we get an indication of that carcass, whether being it's under muscled or it's over muscled. And we'll make adjustments to the yield grade equation based on that. In the plant, a grader does a visual examination, estimating that ribeye size. With the aid of camera technology, we're also able to do an even better job of predicting that square inches. And then that's used in the yield grade equation. So it's square inches.
Very good. Very good. All right. I don't see any, I haven't seen any other questions come in. Dr. Martin, thank you for joining us. Do you have any additional comments that you would like to make? Oh, we're starting to see a few questions come in, so why don't we go ahead and talk about them. The first one that came in, you briefly discussed ribeye camera grading. How is this currently being used in the plant? Does this have any factor in USDA grading, or is this just for plant use? Bucky, I think in session 4, we're going to get a real deep dive and overview of the camera grading. Can you want to kind of give them a precursor to what can be expected?
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about instrument grading and camera assisted grading, if you will. For the camera, it was adopted, I think it was back in, trying to remember the exact date. It was adopted for use in augmenting the USDA grader on the line. About a little over 2/3 of the graded carcasses in plants is using a camera technology to assist it. So it's a technology that is used to enhance the grading equations. Certainly plants can have the option to use cameras in an offline manner for things like sorting or various other activities, but for the USDA official yield and quality grades, cameras are being used to assist the grader.
Very good, very good. The second question that came in, I believe has on the topic of the pH, is the method of knocking or the process in the cooler or chilling the carcass, does it have a major effect on the pH of the meat? And then how does that affect its quality?
So I can answer this. It does. Both the stunning method, so knocking and then the chilling process or cooling process impacts post-mortem pH decline. We've struggled as an industry a bit as carcasses get bigger. The chilling process really hasn't changed a whole lot. So we've seen some fluctuations here in the past decade or so that we haven't really observed prior to that. One thing we know that pH decline after the animal's harvested has an impact on juiciness, water holding capacity, so the ability of the muscle to maintain water inside of the muscle or release all of its water. It impacts color, it impacts tenderness. So it really does impact every facet of meat palatability that we talked about. And it becomes a balance of managing size of the carcass with the cooling method and the capacity of the plant to cool that carcass in a way that you don't adversely impact quality due to pH decline. So it's just one of the phrases I used in my presentation was balancing meat quality really is an art. And it goes just simple things like chilling and managing pH decline is a very delicate process that has major implications on quality of the carcass and finished products.
Very good, very good. Thanks for that response. Very in depth there. We saw another question come through. How does early weaning and creep feeding calves affect carcass quality? Who wants to take a shot at that one?
So there have been quite a few studies published over the past few years about creep feeding specifically and its role in marbling development. And so there's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that the early weaning, putting on a higher concentrate diet earlier in the process aids in marbling development. So absolutely, I think it goes back to still those fat cells develop prior to birth. So it goes back to cow nutrition and cow management as well. If you don't take care of your cows, it really doesn't matter how you manage the calves. So it's you can't just focus on one piece of the puzzle. It has to be comprehensive, but absolutely can play a role.
Very good, very good. We did receive a question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read the question. Does yield grade affect pH and chilling time? Do fatter carcasses cool slower? There. Who would like to answer that? Dr. Gwartney?
I'll give a layman's description, and then Jennifer can fill us in with the technical stuff. But in essence, yeah, the fat cover in particular and muscle mass as well are going to have a big influence on the cooling effect. And in fact, a lot of research done in the past has shown, you know, that a minimum amount of fat cover really is what you kind of need for that good insulation and proper cooling. You don't want to overcool, if you will. So it can definitely have an impact. Jennifer already mentioned the fact that heavier carcasses are problematic. So Jennifer, fill in.
That you're exactly right. It's just more tissue to chill. And so when our goal in chilling carcasses is to chill the muscle. So if there's fat on the outside, we're chilling fat and it's taking longer to chill the muscle. So it's same with people. If we have extra external fat, it takes longer to cool us down. So the same thing works for cows.
Yeah, I can attest to that. Very good. I have a couple more questions that we received. Do you foresee that the chilling process pH comes across what I think we already maybe adapted that question. Let's see, do you foresee that the chilling process / pH concerns cause carcass weight to plateau over time, or will plants just adapt and carcass weights will increase indefinitely?
I would just off the top of my head say, you know, that the carcass weights continue to increase. There has to be an upper limit. I don't know what that is, whether it's, you know, genetics, but I will say that that's true for most of our animal species, our lamb, our pork, and those types of things. So bottom line is, though, that the industry has done a fantastic job of managing that growth and that increase. So where this goes from here, I can't predict that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's really amazing to be inside of plants and see how plants have gotten creative with chilling bigger carcasses. And so I think there's a lot of innovation and just old-fashioned ingenuity that's really come into play to chill these bigger carcasses.
We're really starting to see a lot of questions coming in now. Glad to hear it. Glad to see this. So question that we just seen, at what age is early weaning? What age do they consider early weaning?
That's a good question, and it really varies. I'm not a beef cattle producer, so I won't pretend to know specifics and won't speak to those who do this for a living. But in my experience and what the research tells us is it varies across the country and regions, and really what the market looks like and what the goal of the producer would be. So I don't know that there's a finite time that would qualify for early weaning that would fit the entire country.
Okay. Well, we got three more questions here. Will we ever have the fat removed to a 1/4 inch on the harvest floor for better chilling? Or do we know of, is that being done in any plants?
I know that in some plants, we are taking out some of the internal fat, Jody, in terms to get some more cooling, and there's some adjustment factors involved with that. there's also been a mountain of research done on hot fat trimming, if you will, trying to take fat off when it's hot and aiding both in cooling effects and things like that. You run into some issues there, again, with chilling too fast potentially. And then from a grading perspective, we have to have that kind of that true fat thickness and evaluation to be able to get a proper yield grade. So there's some challenges with that. I'm not saying that it certainly couldn't be something very innovative to look at in the future. I think there was another question real quick on the aging of the carcass and how that can affect tenderness. You know, as you know, in the olden days, if you will, when we would hang carcasses in a cooler or a custom slaughter for a couple of weeks, we were getting that carcass aging. Now what we're doing, we're aging those products in bags in the box, or maybe we're doing a dry aging application. But aging, whether it's dry or wet aging, is absolutely one of the best tools we have in terms of making a more tender product. And some great research was done at Colorado State and resulted in some really good publications published by the cattlemen looking at aging as a tool and showing different recommendations for different muscles. So yeah, aging is absolutely critical.
Okay. One more. What is the optimal time to chill a carcass before grading?
So 24 to 36 hours is really I think probably a common and optimal time. It gets plenty of time to chill, plenty of time, obviously, to allow for bloom, and that seems to be what we see across the industry, somewhere within that time frame.
Good
I
to
think
know.
there's always a push to go faster, right? So it's always, as cattle inventories increase, there's I think everyone's pushing that 24-hour envelope, and you may see situations where cattle are graded before that, but on the whole, I think it's a pretty good range.
Good to know. I know that for the CME carcass delivery process that we talked about at last session, and then we'll learn more about in session 4, those carcasses have to be graded within 3 days of delivery, so 36 hours within delivery. Well, at this time, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Did Dr. Gwartney or Dr. Martin, do either one of you have some closing comments that you would like to share before we move on to the final close?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would like to say is the industry's done a really great job of responding to quality concerns that have been documented through research, industry research that's been performed, whether that's investment in tenderness or investment in strategies to improve beef quality. They've come a long way, and now we have high quality beef that's consistently high quality, but I think even higher than that, the investment in where we're going from here with the technology that exists today and the number of scientists who are still invested in not settling for the quality at present, but continuing to improve quality and consistency. It's just a really remarkable story for the industry to be able to tell on how far they've come in a relatively short amount of time. And really, the sky's the limit as to where they can go from here.
Yeah, Jody, I would just remind people, to join us in session 4. We'll dive a little deeper into beef and quality and yield grade. So thanks for your attention tonight. And I really enjoyed working with Jennifer on this session. Thanks, Jennifer.
All right. Well, with that, then we'll go ahead and move into our closing comments. If we missed a question, please reach out to the presenters directly. You will be able to find their email address in the presentation, which will be available online within the next few days. Along with that, we will be posting the recorded session as well. I do want to make everyone aware that session 1 has been posted to the Cattle Carcass Training website, an uninterrupted version, by the way. So if you would like to learn more about what was covered in session number 1, please visit the Cattle Carcass website for more information. I do want to remind everyone that you will be receiving a participation email that you can send a survey. Please know that your survey responses are appreciated and anonymous. We will use the responses to develop future training webinar series through the cattle carcass training session. At this time, I want to remind everybody that the next session will be December 8th from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, or 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. The topic will be live cattle evaluation, factors for evaluating quality of live cattle, and the CME live delivery process. The host for session 3 will be West Texas A&M and the Agriculture Marketing Service. This concludes our presentation tonight. Thank you for joining. Have a safe week, and we look forward to seeing you back here next week.